On the 15th of August, 1914, a cargo steamship named the SS Ancon entered the Panama Canal from the Atlantic side at Cristobal. 9 hours later, it sailed out into the Pacific Ocean. That single voyage cut 8,000 miles off the journey from New York to San Francisco. 200 dignitaries stood on the deck. Colonel George Washington Goethals, the Army engineer who had overseen the final years of construction, watched from a rail car on the bank. There was no grand celebration, no fleet of international warships, no parade. 3 weeks earlier, Europe had plunged into the First World War, and the world had other things on its mind. It had taken 33 years, 2 countries, and the lives of more than 25,000 workers to make those 9 hours possible. Picture a Barbadian laborer in the Culebra Cut in 1907. He is 23 years old. He left Bridgetown the year before because the sugar economy collapsed and there was nothing left for him on the island. Nearly 20,000 Barbadians made the same journey, so many that the island's population dropped from 200,000 to 172,000 inches. A single decade. He earns 10 cents an hour. His shovel weighs 4 pounds. His shift is 10 hours, 6 days a week. The temperature is 91 degrees. The humidity is 96%. The rain, when it comes, does not cool anything. It just turns the ground to a soup of clay and blasting debris that sucks at his boots with every step. Around him, the canyon walls of the cut rise over 270 feet straight up, and dozens of Bucyrus steam shovels are clawing them down toward a depth no one is entirely sure they can reach. The noise is so loud, so constant, so crushing. Hundreds of pneumatic drills, dozens of steam shovels, loading trains, locomotive whistles, shouted orders in English, Spanish, French, Creole, and Bajan dialect, and the percussive slam of dynamite blasts that never stop, that the historian David McCullough would later write that for 7 years, the Culebra Cut was never silent, not even for an hour. This laborer is one of more than 55,000 workers on the canal that year. Thousands of them have already died, most of malaria, some of yellow fever. Some crushed under landslides that swallowed entire hillsides in seconds, some torn apart by premature dynamite blasts, some struck by rocks hurled hundreds of yards through the air by explosions. The canal will not be finished for 7 more years. This is how America dug the Panama Canal before diesel engines existed. To understand why the Americans were in Panama at all, you have to start with the French. And to start with the French, you have to start with one man and the colossal miscalculation that killed 22,000 people. Ferdinand de Lesseps was 74 years old in 1879 when he announced he would build a canal across the Isthmus of Panama. He was, at that moment, one of the most famous men in Europe. He had built the Suez Canal 10 years earlier, connecting the Mediterranean to the Red Sea through 120 miles of flat Egyptian desert, and the whole world had watched him do it. Suez made de Lesseps a national hero in France. Gambetta gave him the title Le Grand Français. He was feted in Paris, worshipped by investors, celebrated by governments. It also made him dangerously, fatally overconfident. Panama is not Egypt. Egypt is flat, dry desert where the biggest engineering challenge was moving sand. Panama is a mountainous jungle, soaked by 105 inches of rain every year, bisected by the Chagres River, which could go from a calm stream to a raging torrent in hours, and crawling with Aedes aegypti and Anopheles mosquitoes carrying diseases that no one in 1880 understood. The terrain rises to over 300 feet above sea level at the Continental Divide. The rock is volcanic basalt sitting on layers of unstable clay. The wet season lasts 9 months. De Lesseps did not care about any of it. He insisted on building a sea-level canal, a straight cut from ocean to ocean with no locks, just as he had done at Suez. Multiple engineers told him it could not be done. A senior French engineer named Adolphe Godin de Lepinay publicly warned that there was too much water, the rocks were exceedingly hard, the soil was hilly, and the climate was deadly. De Lesseps waved them all off. Digging at Culebra began on the 22nd of January 1881. Almost immediately, the jungle began killing the workforce. Yellow fever swept through the camps in waves. A young engineer named Etienne died in July of 1881, supposedly of brain fever. That was the euphemism. Nobody wanted to say yellow fever out loud because it would cause panic. Henri Bion, a financial authority and personal friend of de Lesseps who had come from Paris to inspect progress, attended a dinner at the workers' camp at Gamboa. When he arrived, a Norwegian woman at the table exclaimed that there were 13 diners, an omen of death. Bion laughed it off. 2 weeks later, on his way back to France, he was dead of fever. His body was buried at sea. A Canadian doctor working in the zone estimated that between 30 and 40 workers were dying every day during the wet seasons of 1882 and 1883. An estimated 3/4 of the French engineers who arrived in Panama died within 3 months of stepping off the boat. The conditions were medieval. Hospitals set the legs of patients' beds in cans of water to keep ants from crawling up. Nobody understood that those cans of standing water were breeding grounds for the mosquitoes that were actually transmitting the disease. Workers slept in barracks with unscreened windows. The camps were surrounded by jungle and standing water. Every effort to fight the disease was accidentally making it worse. By the late 1880s, de Lesseps had burned through the equivalent of more than $10 billion in today's money. The Compagnie Universelle had barely lowered the summit of the Culebra Ridge by 20 feet over its original height, and only across a narrow width. Landslides kept pouring mud and clay back into the excavation faster than men could remove it. The company declared bankruptcy on the 4th of February, 1889. 800,000 French investors, including 15,000 single women who had put their savings into canal shares, lost everything. De Lesseps and his son Charles were convicted of fraud and sentenced to 5 years in prison, though the sentence was never carried out. Gustave Eiffel, the man who built the tower, was also convicted for his financial involvement. And somewhere around 22,000 workers, most of them from the Caribbean, were dead. Some estimates from the era suggest that 500 French engineers arrived in Panama, and none of them lived to collect their first month's pay. The French left behind rusting equipment, decaying buildings, a partially dug ditch, and a graveyard. But they also left behind proof that a canal was physically possible if someone was willing to change the design. They had excavated over 75 million cubic yards of material before going bankrupt. They had lowered the summit of the Culebra Ridge and proved that the rock, while punishing, could be broken. A restructured French company, the Compagnie Nouvelle, offered to sell the rights, the equipment, and the partially completed work to the United States for $40 million. Theodore Roosevelt wanted the canal. He wanted it badly. He believed an interoceanic waterway was essential to American naval power, especially after the Spanish-American War in 1898, when the battleship USS Oregon had to sail 16,000 miles around Cape Horn to reach the fighting, a 6-7-day voyage that made the strategic case for a canal impossible to ignore. The United States tried to negotiate with Colombia, which owned Panama. When Colombia refused American terms, the U.S. backed a Panamanian independence movement. The revolution lasted 1 day. American warships stood offshore. Within 2 weeks, the new nation of Panama signed a treaty granting the United States permanent control of a 10-mile-wide canal zone across the isthmus. That is how America came to be standing in a jungle ditch in 1904, staring at the same mountain that had broken the French. The man who figured out how to beat that mountain was a railroad engineer from Maine named John Frank Stevens. When the United States took over the canal project on the 4th of May 1904, a small delegation of Americans went to the Grand Hotel in Panama City, the same hotel where de Lesseps had held his first planning meetings 25 years earlier, raised the American flag on the flagpole, and took possession of the keys to the French storehouses and hospital. The first 2 years were chaos on a grand scale. The first American chief engineer, John Finley Wallace, arrived in Panama, surveyed the disease, the mud, the rotting French equipment, and the scale of the problem, and quietly imported a metal coffin for himself. He planned his escape route before he planned a single excavation. By June of 1905, 3/4 of the original American contingent had fled the isthmus. Wallace resigned and returned home with the coffin. It was occupied by the corpse of one of his workers. Stevens arrived in July of 1905, and he was a fundamentally different kind of man. He had pushed railroads through the Cascade Mountains of Washington state. He understood logistics on a continental scale. He understood that before you could dig a canal, you had to build the infrastructure to support the digging: railroads, supply depots, housing, kitchens, hospitals, sanitation systems. And he understood something fundamental that de Lesseps never accepted. A sea-level canal through Panama was suicide. The terrain was too high, the rock too hard, the landslides too unpredictable, and the Chagres River, which flooded violently and repeatedly, would make any sea-level cut a death trap for ships. Stevens argued instead for a lock canal. Build a massive dam across the Chagres River at Gatun. Flood 164 square miles of jungle to create an artificial lake 85 feet above sea level. Then build locks, enormous stepped concrete chambers, to lift ships from the ocean up to the lake and lower them back down on the other side. It was elegant. It was practical. And it required excavating the Culebra Cut to only 40 feet above sea level instead of all the way down to the ocean, saving tens of millions of cubic yards of digging. But before any of this could begin, Stevens had to solve the problem that had crippled every previous attempt: logistics. You cannot dig a canal if you cannot move the dirt. The French had 120 miles of narrow-gauge track and inadequate rolling stock. Stevens ripped it all out and rebuilt it. He laid heavy-duty, double-tracked, standard-gauge railroad across the isthmus. He ordered new locomotives, new flat cars, new steam-powered track shifters that could pick up an entire section of rail and move it sideways. He designed the excavation system to function like an industrial conveyor belt. Steam shovels loaded broken rock onto flat cars, trains hauled the flat cars to dump sites, Lidgerwood unloaders dragged the spoil off the cars with steel plows, and the empty cars circled back for another load. At peak capacity, the system moved 200 trainloads of excavated material out of the Culebra Cut every day. Inside the cut itself, 75 miles of track had to be constantly shifted as the digging deepened. Hundreds of men worked around the clock just moving rails. Stevens also rebuilt the Panama Railroad, the original transcontinental line built in the 1850s, because large sections of it would be submerged under the new Gatun Lake. The U.S. Senate approved Stevens' Lock Canal plan in June of 1906 by a margin of just 5 votes. If 3 senators had voted differently, the United States would have attempted a sea-level canal and would almost certainly have failed, just as the French had. Those 5 votes made the Panama Canal possible. Stevens made a second decision that saved thousands of lives. He gave full authority and unlimited resources to Dr. William Crawford Gorgas, the Army surgeon who had eradicated yellow fever in Havana after the Spanish-American War. Gorgas had arrived in Panama in 1904, but for his first year, the canal commissioners had starved him of funding. They did not believe mosquitoes caused disease. They thought yellow fever came from bad air, swamp gas, filth, moral weakness. One commissioner told Gorgas to his face that his mosquito theory was absurd. Stevens overruled them all and told Gorgas to spend whatever it took. What Gorgas did was nothing less than a second engineering project overlaid on top of the first. His teams drained every puddle, every ditch, every standing pool of water within miles. They spread oil on the surfaces of streams, ponds, and swamps to suffocate mosquito larvae. They screened every window in every building in the canal zone. They fumigated entire towns. They cleared brush for 200 yards around every settlement to eliminate mosquito habitat. They installed running water systems so workers would stop storing water in open barrels and cans, the same containers that had been breeding mosquitoes in the French hospitals. The campaign was methodical, relentless, and enormously expensive. At the peak of canal operations, 102 American physicians and 130 trained nurses staffed the zone's hospitals. The last case of yellow fever in Panama was recorded on the 7th of December, 1906. Yellow fever, the disease that had killed thousands of French workers and driven 3/4 of the first American contingent off the isthmus, was gone from the canal zone in just 2 years. Treatment for yellow fever patients at Ancon Hospital had consisted of complete bed rest, nothing by mouth except sips of iced champagne, and careful monitoring of urinary output. The onset of black vomit meant death was coming. Between July 1904 and December 1906, the hospital recorded 246 yellow fever admissions with a mortality rate of 34%. After Gorgas, there were none. Malaria was never fully conquered. It remained a presence throughout the construction period, responsible for more hospital admissions than any other disease. But Gorgas reduced it from a mass killer to a manageable threat. Before his intervention, the disease death rate was catastrophic. After it, the death rate in the canal zone dropped to levels comparable to a typical American city. Stevens resigned in February 1907, for reasons that have never been fully explained. His replacement was Major George Washington Goethals, a West Point-trained Army engineer with experience in canal and lock design. Goethals would see the canal to completion over the next 7 years. He traveled the zone in a yellow rail car inspecting every site, and he held open hearings every Sunday morning where any worker, from the highest engineer to the lowest silver roll laborer, could bring a grievance directly to him. And now the real work began. The work that would move mountains. The workforce that built the Panama Canal came from everywhere and was divided by everything. At its peak, more than 56,000 men were employed. But the composition of that workforce, and the system under which it labored, tells a story that the celebration of the canal's opening conveniently omitted. The largest single group was West Indian. At least 20,000 came from Barbados. Thousands more came from Jamaica, from Martinique, from Guadeloupe, from Trinidad, from Street, Lucia, from Antigua. Another 12,000 came from the United States. 8,000 came from Spain. Smaller numbers came from Italy, Greece, Colombia, India, and Panama itself. They did not work under the same system. The Isthmian Canal Commission divided its payroll into 2 categories that became the defining social structure of the canal zone for decades after the canal was built: the gold roll and the silver roll. Gold roll employees were paid in American gold-backed dollars at rates higher than comparable jobs in the United States. They received furnished housing with screened windows, free meals at commission hotels where dinner cost 30 cents, access to clubhouses, bowling alleys, social organizations like the Brotherhood of Railroad Trainmen and the Odd Fellows. 30 days of paid leave per year. Their commissaries were stocked with imported American goods. Their hospital wards were clean, well-staffed, and racially exclusive. Their children went to gold roll schools. Their mail was collected at gold roll post office windows. Silver roll employees were paid in local silver-backed currency at roughly half the rate. A gold roll steam shovel engineer might make several dollars a day. A silver roll laborer made 10 cents an hour. Silver roll workers received no furnished housing, no free meals, no clubhouses, no recreational facilities. Their commissaries were separate, stocked with lower quality goods at higher relative prices. Their hospital wards were separate. Their post office windows were separate. Their drinking fountains were separate. Even their pay windows were separate. The gold roll was white. The silver roll was not. Over time, between 1905 and 1908, under Chief Engineers Stevens and Goethals, the distinction was deliberately tightened to enforce racial segregation. Skilled West Indian workers who should have qualified for gold roll positions were demoted to the silver roll. The gold roll was formally restricted to U.S. and Panamanian citizens by executive order. The system was Jim Crow exported to the tropics, and it governed every aspect of life in the canal zone, from the food you ate to the hospital bed you died in. It was not fully phased out until the 1960s. And it was silver roll men, overwhelmingly, who did the most dangerous work on the canal: the drilling, the dynamiting, the riveting, the labor at the bottom of the Culebra cut, where the walls could bury you at any moment. Before the cut could become a canal, Stevens' lock plan required something else that had never been done at this scale: the Gatun Dam. This was the structure that would tame the Chagres River and create the artificial lake at the heart of the canal. The dam was 1.5 miles long and 105 feet tall, built primarily from earth and rock excavated from the canal itself. The rock that was broken and excavated from the Culebra cut was loaded onto trains, hauled across the isthmus, and dumped into the rising walls of the dam. The two projects fed each other. What the mountain lost, the dam gained. It was an elegant symmetry, but the work of building it was brutal. Workers in the Gatun Dam section labored in swamp and river mud, wrestling with a soft bottom that swallowed material as fast as they could dump it. Entire trainloads of rock would sink into the muck and virtually disappear. When completed, the dam created Gatun Lake, covering 164 square miles of former jungle, the largest artificial lake in the world at the time. Entire villages were relocated. Forests were drowned. The Panama Railroad had to be rerouted to higher ground. The lake still provides the 52 million gallons of fresh water consumed by every single ship that transits the canal today. The Culebra Cut was the spine of the entire project. It was the place where the canal had to pass through the Continental Divide, the mountain ridge that separates the Atlantic watershed from the Pacific. The cut stretched nearly 9 miles from Gamboa on the Chagres River at the north to Pedro Miguel on the south. The highest point of the ridge, at the saddle between Gold Hill and Contractors Hill, stood 333 feet above sea level. It had to be brought down to 40 feet. Major David Dubose Gaillard of the Army Corps of Engineers was given the task. You are looking at the removal of over 100 million cubic yards of rock and earth. That is roughly half of all the material excavated for the entire canal. If you loaded every cubic yard into a railroad car and lined them up end to end, the train would circle the earth 4 times. The process worked like this. 3 massive air compressor plants fed compressed air through 30 miles of pipe to power hundreds of pneumatic drills. Those drills bored holes 24 feet deep into the rock face. A small charge of black powder was detonated at the bottom of each hole to enlarge the cavity. Then workers packed the enlarged holes with as much as 200 pounds of dynamite each. Up to 400,000 pounds of dynamite were detonated every single month. More than 600 blast holes were fired daily. In some locations, 52,000 pounds of dynamite were packed and detonated in a single blast. In total, over 60 million pounds of dynamite were consumed during the American excavation. The largest supplier was DuPont, which designed a new waterproof electric fuse specifically for the damp conditions in the cut, and then upgraded their entire product line based on what they learned. When the charges went off, twice a day, at noon, and after the 5 o'clock quitting time, it sounded like the steady booming of artillery echoing off canyon walls, hundreds of feet high. After the blast, the Bucyrus steam shovels moved in. These were 9 5-ton machines built by the Bucyrus Foundry and Manufacturing Company in South Milwaukee, Wisconsin. Each one had a 5 cubic yard bucket capable of lifting roughly 8 tons of broken rock in a single bite. They were operated by crews of 4, an engineer, 2 firemen who shoveled coal into the boiler, and a craneman. A support crew of 6 on the ground laid and shifted the railroad tracks. The shovels moved on. Bucyrus supplied 77 of the 102 steam shovels used on the canal. At the peak of work in the cut, as many as 68 were operating simultaneously, and their performance was tracked and published weekly in the Canal Record, creating fierce competition between shovel crews. In March of 1910, a single Bucyrus shovel set a canal record by excavating 70,000 cubic yards in 25 working days. Each shovel averaged over 1 million cubic yards of material during its time in the cut. The broken rock was loaded onto trains of 27 flat cars each, hauled by locomotives to dump sites up to 12 miles away. Some of the spoil was used to create a breakwater connecting 4 small islands in Panama Bay, a causeway that still exists today. At peak construction, 150 to 175 loaded trains left the Culebra Cut every single day. A train moved in or out roughly every minute of the working day. 6,000 men worked in the cut during daylight hours. Another 400 worked through the night, maintaining shovels, replenishing coal bins, blasting more rock, and shifting rails to prepare for the next day. And then there were the landslides. The canal engineers were completely unprepared for them. The geology was treacherous in a way that existing engineering knowledge could not predict. Layers of hard volcanic basalt sat on top of softer clay, and when excavation removed the lateral support from those layers, the weight of the hill above crushed the weakened clay and forced it sideways into the canal trench, heaving the floor upward. The mathematics needed to understand slope failure would not be developed until the 1930s. Gaillard described the slides as tropical glaciers, made of mud instead of ice. The first major slide hit on the 4th of October 1907. 500,000 cubic yards of clay poured into the excavation, swallowing equipment and burying weeks of progress in minutes. The clay was too soft for the steam shovels. It had to be washed out with high-pressure water jets. And the slides kept coming. One on the west bank, in front of the village of Culebra, covered 75 acres and required the removal of 10 million additional cubic yards of material. Buildings in the village had to be dismantled and moved. Another slide at Cucaracha in January 1913 dropped 2 million cubic yards of earth into the nearly completed cut, forcing engineers to flood it and finish the clearing with dredges. By the time the cut was finished, landslides had added 30 million cubic yards of extra material to the excavation. That was 1/4 of the total amount removed. The original estimate for the cut was 53 million cubic yards. The final number was over 100 million. Every year the estimate climbed: 78 million in 1908, 84 million in 1910, 89 million in 1911, 94 million in 1912. The mountain kept fighting back. And the slides did not stop when the canal opened. A massive slide on the 18th of September, 1915, closed the canal for 7 months. If you had stood on the rim of the Culebra Cut at the height of construction, you would have witnessed something that looked like industrial warfare. Walls of scarred rock hundreds of feet high on both sides, terraced by months of drilling and blasting. Dozens of steam shovels crawling along the floor, their buckets swinging, black smoke pouring from their coal-fired stacks. Trains snaking in and out on tracks that moved daily, the constant thunder of dynamite, the shriek of compressed air drills boring into basalt, the clang of steel buckets striking rock, the shouting of 6,000 men in a dozen languages. The heat thick enough to press against your skin like wet cloth. The stench of coal smoke, nitroglycerine, sulfur, and wet clay. And, above it all, the knowledge that the wall you were standing beneath could give way without warning and bury everything for 100 yards. One laborer named Antonio Sanchez said work in the cut was like going to a battlefield. Men died regularly. They died from premature dynamite blasts that detonated while the holes were still being packed. They died when rocks hurled by explosions struck them from hundreds of yards away. There was no warning system sophisticated enough to clear the cut in time. They died when trains derailed on the constantly shifting tracks inside the narrow canyon. They died when scaffolding collapsed beneath them. They died when landslides buried them alive under thousands of tons of mud and rock. The injuries were so frequent and so severe, limbs crushed by falling boulders, hands torn off by machinery, skulls fractured by flying debris, that artificial limb manufacturers competed for contracts with the Canal Administration. A company called AA. Marx advertised that its waterproof prosthetic arms and legs were most suited to the climate and conditions of the locality. That is how many men were being maimed in the Culebra Cut. Enough to create a profitable market for replacement limbs. While the Culebra Cut consumed most of the labor and dynamite, the locks were the structural triumph of the canal, and they were built at a scale the world had never attempted. 3 sets of locks were required. At Gatun, on the Atlantic side, a triple flight lifted ships 85 feet from the ocean to the surface of Gatun Lake. At Pedro Miguel, a single lock lowered ships 31 feet. At Miraflores, 2 more locks brought them the remaining distance to the Pacific. Each lock chamber measured 110 feet wide and 1,000 feet long. The walls were 45 to 55 feet thick at the base, tapering to 8 feet at the top. The lock gates were hollow steel, built like ship hulls, so they would be buoyant when the chambers filled. The largest gates at Miraflores weighed over 700 tons each and stood as tall as 8-story buildings. Concrete pouring began at Gatun on the 24th of August, 1909. Over the next 4 years, workers poured nearly 4.5 million cubic yards of concrete across all 3 lock sites. The Gatun locks alone consumed more than 2 million cubic yards. No concrete structure of comparable size had ever been built anywhere on Earth. The technology itself was relatively new. The Army Corps of Engineers had only adopted reinforced concrete in the 1890s. Nobody knew how the material would behave at this volume. Core samples were drilled from the walls during construction to test the concrete's integrity as it cured. Nothing of similar scale would be attempted again until the Hoover Dam, 2 decades later. The concrete was mixed on site and transported by overhead steel cableways strung between 8 5-foot towers on the banks. Buckets running on 2.5-inch steel wire cables carried 6 tons of concrete at a time into the lock forms below. Electric railways brought stone, sand, and cement from the docks to the mixers. Erecting the lock gates was one of the most dangerous jobs in the entire zone. Rivet gangs, mostly West Indian silver roll workers, worked on scaffolding high above the chamber floors. As many as 165 rivet gangs worked at once. Together they drove more than 6 million rivets. At the peak of gate construction, 660,000 rivets were driven in a single month. The scaffolding was unstable. Falls were common. Men died with riveting hammers still in their hands. Water moved through the completed locks entirely by gravity. No pumps were used. Giant culverts 18 feet in diameter ran through the walls, with smaller culverts branching under the floor of each chamber, 100 openings per chamber through which water could rise or drain. Every transit consumed roughly 52 million gallons of fresh water. The entire system was controlled by electricity generated at Gatun Dam, operated from control boards that functioned as working miniature models of the locks, designed so that the operator had to follow the correct sequence and physically could not make an error. The official American death toll from 1904 to 1914 was 5,609 workers. That number is almost certainly too low. Deaths of Silver Roll workers who died after being discharged or who died in surrounding towns rather than in canal hospitals were frequently unrecorded. Some historians believe the real number may have been several times higher. Think about what a day looked like for the average Silver Roll laborer. You woke before dawn in a barracks or a shack in one of the labor camps strung along the canal route. If you were lucky, you had a cot. Many men slept in hammocks or on the ground. The Isthmian Canal Commission provided nothing for the accommodation, provisions, or entertainment of Silver Roll employees. Nothing. You found your own food. You cooked it yourself or bought it from the West Indian women who ran boarding houses and market stalls, the unofficial economy that kept the entire workforce alive. You walked to your work site in the dark. You worked 10 hours in heat that could reach 120 degrees Fahrenheit at the bottom of the Culebra Cut, where the rock walls amplified and trapped the sun. You breathed coal smoke, dynamite fumes, and rock dust. You had no hearing protection against the noise of hundreds of machines, no safety equipment beyond a shovel and a pair of boots. If you were injured, you were taken to a Silver Roll hospital ward. If the injury was severe enough that you could not work, you might be put on a ship home with nothing. If you died, your body was buried at Mount Hope, and your family might or might not be told. Of the 5,609 recorded deaths, 4,290 were Caribbean workers. In 1910 alone, 548 died. The breakdown: 167 from Barbados, 113 from Jamaica, 49 from Martinique and Guadeloupe, 60 from other islands, 48 from Spain, 36 from Colombia and Panama, 31 from the United States. When combined with the French toll of roughly 22,000, the total approaches 28,000. Each mile of the canal cost an estimated 500 lives. The dead were not treated equally. Gold Roll families received benefits, notifications, the option to ship remains home. Silver Roll families often received nothing. Compensation policies were not formally applied until 1908, 4 years into construction. Before that, injured Silver Roll workers were deported. Some ended up on charity farms, some simply disappeared from the records. The women they left behind in Barbados and Jamaica, wives and mothers and sisters, sent hundreds of petitions to British and American administrators, begging for information about missing husbands, for compensation for dead sons, for any acknowledgement that their men had existed. On the 20th of May, 1913, steam shovels number 222 and number 230, working from opposite ends, met at the bottom of the Culebra Cut. The mountain had been brought down to 40 feet above sea level. 7 years. Over 100 million cubic yards. Tens of thousands of men. Major Gaillard was promoted to colonel. 1 month later, on the 5th of December, 1913, he died of a brain tumor in Baltimore. He never saw the canal open. On the 10th of October 1913, President Wilson pressed a telegraph key in Washington. The signal detonated the Gamboa Dike. Water from Gatun Lake flooded the Culebra Cut. The Atlantic and Pacific were joined. The SS Ancon made the first official transit on the 15th of August, 1914. It entered the Gatun Locks, rose 85 feet to Gatun Lake, crossed the lake, passed through the cut, descended through Pedro Miguel and Miraflores, and sailed into the Pacific. 9 hours. Goethals watched from the bank. The world was at war. The celebration was quiet. The total cost was $375 million in 1914 dollars, equivalent to roughly 10 to 16 billion today. Finished a year ahead of schedule, $23 million under budget. The most expensive American construction project to that date. One of the 7 wonders of the modern engineering world. In 1914, nearly 95% of the world's ocean-going vessels were less than 600 feet long, far smaller than the 1,000-foot lock chambers the engineers had built. They had designed the canal not just for their own time, but for the next century. The original locks remained in service without fundamental modification for over 100 years, until the expansion completed in 2016 added a new, larger set of locks to handle the even bigger vessels of the modern era. The concrete poured in 1909 is still holding. The gravity-fed water system still works. The culverts still flow. The human cost is harder to calculate than the engineering legacy, because the records were kept by the people who had the least interest in keeping them accurately. The gold roll deaths were documented. The silver roll deaths were often estimated, rounded down, or simply omitted. A few documentaries made decades later tracked down elderly survivors, men in their 80s and 90s who had been teenagers in the Culebra Cut. Some of them wept on camera. Not from sadness exactly, from the disbelief that they had lived through it at all. Today, 14,000 ships transit the Panama Canal every year. They pass through the Culebra Cut and glide through locks that still operate on the gravity-fed system designed in 1906. Through concrete poured between 1,909 and 1,913. Past steel gates held together by 6 million rivets, driven by West Indian men on swaying scaffolding. Every cargo ship is floating over the work of men who were paid 10 cents an hour. Men from Barbados, Jamaica, Martinique, Spain, Colombia, men whose labor cut a continent in half and saved every vessel an 8,000-mile voyage around Cape Horn. Men whose names fill the grave registry at Mount Hope Cemetery near Colon, the largest from any American engineering project. Rows of concrete markers, names when they were recorded. Many say only unknown. The gold roll workers were honored. The silver roll workers built the canal, died building the canal, and then the system that paid them half as much erased them from the story. If this is your first time here, subscribe. This channel tells the stories of the men and women who built the world with their hands, before the machines did it for them. The water still rises in the locks, the ships still pass through the cut, and the debt owed to the men who dug it, who drilled it, who packed it with dynamite, who drove 6 million rivets, who stood beneath walls that could bury them, for wages that would not feed a family, that debt is still unpaid. They were not machines. They were men. And they did something that had defeated every attempt for 400 years.